The first time Morty wandered into the garage, he wasn't looking for adventure. He was simply following a smell that didn't belong in the house, the faint sweetness of oil mixed with the dry sparkle of metal shavings, like winter air inside a clock. The evening was quiet and blue around the windows. Everyone else was watching television, but Morty's feet found their own path to the half-open door at the back of the kitchen. Through it came a low humming. Not mechanical exactly, more like someone whispering and breathing at once. The door gave way with a sigh. Inside, the garage looked nothing like a garage at all. Shelves bowed under the weight of jars filled with powders that glowed in slow pulses like sleeping fireflies. Tools dangled from pegs, yet none of them had handles, Morty recognized. The workbench was dusted with fine green particles that drifted upward instead of down, as though gravity had been told to rest for a moment. Everything moved at a lazy pace, calm and deliberate, as if the room itself knew it was midnight somewhere and wanted to be gentle. Morty stood still, small enough that his reflection fit neatly inside a curved sheet of copper propped against the wall. He could see his hair haloed in the dust's glow, his hands clasped in front of him, the way children do when they're pretending not to be nervous. This wasn't a forbidden place, but it wasn't exactly permitted either. He felt a soft pull toward the benches and the jars, not fear, but curiosity. A moth drawn to a lamp that doesn't burn. Near the back wall, a half-finished contraption ticked and hissed. It wasn't threatening. Its motions were tiny, an arm adjusting a screw, a nozzle sighing a thin vapor that smelled faintly of peppermints. Morty tilted his head, listening, and for a heartbeat he thought he heard words in the rhythm. Slow, round syllables like a lullaby without melody. He didn't understand them, yet some part of him felt welcomed. On a hook by the workbench hung a coat far too large for him. It smelled like distant storms and old books. Morty reached up, brushing his fingertips against the fabric. It was warm, though no one was wearing it. He thought about his grandfather. The way Rick's eyes sometimes glimmered like these jars when he was lost in thought. The way his voice could be harsh, yet carry a hidden kindness. Morty wondered if the glowing dust was something Rick had invented or simply found, like a seashell picked up on a stranger shore. He stepped deeper, each footfall quiet on the concrete floor. The air felt thicker here, as if time had been slowed to keep delicate things from breaking. In the corner, behind stacked boxes, stood a narrow door Morty had never noticed before. It was made of ordinary wood, but in the dim light it shimmered slightly, the grain rippling like water touched by a fingertip. A soft draught flowed from beneath it, cool and smelling of pine needles and rain, even though outside it hadn't rained for weeks. Morty didn't reach for the handle. He just looked. His heartbeat felt round and slow, like the tick of a clock with all the edges sanded off. He thought about how every hallway in a house feels safe until you're the only one awake. He thought about how doors sometimes wait for you to be ready, and how maybe this one was waiting too. The humming of the garage wrapped around him like a low cloud. A jar on the workbench released a faint chime as a bubble rose and burst. The contraption at the back wall settled with a sigh. Even the glowing dust seemed to drift more slowly now, as if aware of the boy watching. Morty stood still, breathing in the scent of strange metal and soft rain. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even sure why he had come. Only that something here, in this quiet room of hidden things, had opened a small place in him, a place where curiosity could bloom without rush, without noise. He imagined, just for a moment, stepping through that narrow door, not into danger, but into a dream. He pictured a long hallway of stars, each one a tiny workshop where some gentle version of his grandfather tinkered with kindness instead of chaos. He pictured himself walking barefoot across a floor of cool light, no urgency, no shouting, only the hush of endless space breathing slowly. Then the picture faded, leaving only the real garage and the glow of jars, and Morty standing there, a boy at the edge of wonder. From the kitchen came the muffled sound of a laugh track on television. It made the garage seem even quieter. Morty let his hands fall to his sides. He didn't open the door. He simply watched it for a little while longer, memorizing the way the wood shimmered and the way the dust curled upward like tiny galaxies. Then he turned, slowly, and walked back toward the warm light of the house. Behind him, the garage settled back into its own slow breathing, a secret keeping itself until the next time he wandered in. He would come back, he didn't know when, but the smell of strange metal and glowing dust had already braided itself into his memory. Long after he fell asleep that night, he would dream of the door again, not as a threshold, but as a quiet invitation. It happened on a Sunday afternoon that felt like a pause between breaths. The television murmured in another room, and sunlight came in through the blinds in thin gold bars. Morty sat at the kitchen table with his elbows tucked in, the way he always did when he was trying not to spill anything. Across from him, Rick rummaged through a paper bag that didn't look especially remarkable. No glowing runes, no swirling mist, just a crumpled brown bag from the corner deli. Yet the air around it felt a little cooler, like the hush that comes before rain. Rick set the bag down and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He didn't say anything about it. He simply slid it across the table to Morty with a half shrug, as if it were nothing at all. Morty hesitated. He'd seen his grandfather hand out all kinds of things before, small gadgets, strange stones, even a jar of air from somewhere that wasn't Earth, but never something as ordinary as lunch. He unwrapped the sandwich slowly, the wax paper crackling like distant thunder. Inside was bread that looked normal enough, and a filling that shimmered faintly, like someone had dusted it with powdered stars. Tiny pinpoints of light moved across the surface, shifting as Morty tilted the sandwich in his hands. It wasn't dazzling or blinding. It was quiet light, like glow-in-the-dark paint just after you switch off the lamp. The smell was warm and familiar, fresh bread, a hint of cheese, but beneath it lingered something crisp and cold, like mountain air. Morty looked up. Rick was pretending to examine a newspaper, but his eyes flicked over the top of the page, watching. Morty took a bite. The taste was gentle, nothing outrageous, just a simple, good sandwich. But, as he chewed, a picture unfolded behind his eyelids, a vast field of slow-spinning constellations, each one no bigger than a pebble, drifting in a pocket of soft darkness. It felt like stepping into a dream where nothing rushed you. He heard a faint hum, almost like the garage at night, and for a moment he imagined himself floating among those stars, turning weightless somersaults. When he swallowed, the kitchen returned. The blinds still striped the sunlight. The table still felt cool under his palms. But something in him had shifted, like a small door opening inward. He glanced at Rick, who was still looking at the newspaper but whose mouth carried the ghost of a smile. No explanation was offered. None was asked for. The sandwich was simply there, waiting for another bite. Morty nibbled again, slower this time, watching the tiny lights drift and rearrange themselves as though responding to his touch. He thought about the glowing dust in the garage, about the narrow door behind the boxes. He thought about how this sandwich, humble and soft, could hold a sky inside it. Maybe it wasn't about power or gadgets. Maybe it was about showing him that small things could contain entire worlds if you knew how to look. Outside, a breeze rattled the branches against the window. Morty felt the same quiet pull he'd felt in the garage, the sense that curiosity wasn't dangerous here, only tender. He put the sandwich down, still half-wrapped, and traced a finger over the wax paper. The crumbs sparkled faintly before fading, like meteors burning up in an atmosphere. He smiled without realizing it. Rick finally lowered the newspaper. "Eat while it's fresh," he muttered, but his tone was softer than usual. Morty nodded. He didn't ask where it came from. He didn't ask why the stars moved or whether they were real. Some part of him understood that questions could wait. This was a gift meant to be experienced, not explained. They sat together in a rare, easy silence. Morty took another bite, and another image bloomed in his mind, a tiny island floating on a black ocean where a boy stood holding a lantern. The boy waved at him, not urgently but kindly, as if to say, "You're welcome here whenever you're ready." Morty felt warmth spread through his chest. The sandwich wasn't making him bigger or stronger. It was making space inside him, a space for quiet wonder. When the last bite was gone, Morty wrapped the paper neatly and set it aside. The kitchen smelled normal again. The sunlight stripes had shifted slightly on the table. He felt full, but not just with food. Full the way you feel after someone tells you a story you didn't know you needed. Rick folded the newspaper, stood up, and carried the bag back to the garage without a word. Morty stayed at the table a moment longer, palms flat on the wood, eyes closed, breathing. Later, when he lay in bed, he would think about the sandwich again, the way the stars moved slowly, the way the taste carried something like memory. He would think about adaptability, about hidden potential, though he didn't have those words for it yet. He would drift to sleep, picturing a humble loaf of bread holding an entire night sky inside it. And somewhere in the garage, a paper bag would sit quietly on a workbench, still cool to the touch, as if holding back another small universe for another quiet day. The days after the star sandwich felt a little different to Morty, though nothing in the house had changed. Morning light still slipped across the carpet in thin beams, and the fridge still hummed with its low, secret note. Yet, inside him, there was a new softness, like a door cracked open to a warm room. He started spending more time in the garage, not as a visitor, but as someone who had been quietly invited. Rick didn't give him gadgets or lessons. He simply let the boy wander among the jars and tools, trusting him to touch only what called to his hands. Morty began with the smallest thing, a single screw that glowed faintly when held a certain way, a droplet of liquid light balanced on a spoon. He would lift it, tilt it, watch it quiver and settle. It was like learning to hold a bird without making it afraid. He whispered to himself as he worked, little phrases of reassurance. It's okay. Stay calm. Nothing's going to break. He didn't realize it yet, but the experiments were teaching him patience, the kind that listens first and acts later. One afternoon he found a cluster of glass beads rolling in a tray. Each bead held a different color mist inside, like tiny storms. When shaken, they gave off a faint chime, and the mist settled into new patterns. Morty spent hours rolling them gently between his palms, discovering which motions soothed the storms and which stirred them. He wasn't trying to make anything happen. He was trying to understand what helped each bead feel safe. Rick watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame, saying nothing. Sometimes Morty would line up small objects on the workbench, an old key, a bent paperclip, a scrap of shimmering foil, and talk to them as if they were shy guests. He would shift their positions, noticing how the glow changed when one object was closer to another, like friends warming each other by proximity. The garage became less of a laboratory and more of a quiet sanctuary, a place where his curiosity and his empathy folded into one motion. He didn't yet know he was practicing science. He only knew he was practicing care. At night, in his room, he repeated the motions with ordinary things, a marble, a pencil, a drop of water on the windowsill. He found that even without glowing dust or humming jars, he could coax a kind of stillness into objects just by holding them gently, breathing slowly. It wasn't magic. It was attention, and it made the world feel softer, as if invisible threads connected everything around him. One evening, Rick slid a shallow dish toward him. Inside floated 3 motes of pale light, each no bigger than a grain of rice. They drifted like tiny seeds in invisible water. "Try not to lose them," Rick said, and went back to tightening a valve on some other contraption. Morty cupped his hands over the dish and leaned close. The motes rose and fell with his breath. Without thinking, he slowed his inhalations until they moved like boats on a calm tide. The light steadied, then glimmered brighter, as if grateful. Morty smiled. He didn't scoop them up or trap them. He simply gave them a place to drift without disturbance. Later he tried something different. He placed one of the motes on his fingertip and held it above the dish. It hovered just above his skin, quivering. Morty whispered, "You're okay." The mote steadied, floating in a perfect bead of light. He moved his hand slowly, side to side, like teaching a bird to balance. The mote followed, neither falling nor fleeing. He realized then that floating wasn't about power. It was about trust, about creating the conditions where falling wasn't necessary. Days passed like this, small trials, gentle adjustments. Morty began to sense patterns in everything, the way a jar's glow dimmed if it was jostled, the way a screw stopped humming when placed next to a certain tool. He started writing tiny notes on scraps of paper, not equations, but impressions. Blue mist likes quiet. 2 motes together pulse slower. Rick glanced at the notes sometimes, but never corrected him. He seemed to understand that Morty wasn't cataloguing data. He was learning how to listen. In school, Morty found himself applying the same patience to people. When a classmate dropped her books, he picked them up without thinking. When another kid sat alone at lunch, Morty sat nearby, not speaking, just offering presents. He noticed how small acts of care shifted the atmosphere the way moving a bead could calm a storm. It wasn't deliberate. It was just the way his hands had learned to move. One evening, the garage was especially quiet. Rick had gone out, leaving Morty alone among the shelves. The narrow door behind the boxes still shimmered faintly, waiting. Morty set a small glass sphere on the workbench, one he'd found tucked in a drawer. Inside swirled a miniature aurora of green and gold. He placed his palms on either side and breathed slowly. The aurora slowed, its colors deepening like dusk over a meadow. Morty felt a stillness spread through him, as if the sphere were calming him as much as he was calming it. He closed his eyes and remembered the sandwich with stars inside. He remembered the first night in the garage, the smell of strange metal and glowing dust. He felt how each small experiment, each quiet moment, was shaping him, not into a hero of battles or a wielder of gadgets, but into someone who could hold fragile things without breaking them, someone who could float without falling. When Rick returned, he found Morty sitting quietly at the bench, the glass sphere resting motionless between his palms. Rick didn't say anything. He just watched for a moment, then set a mug of cocoa down beside the boy and went back to his own work. Morty opened his eyes, smiled faintly, and sipped the warm drink. The garage hummed its low lullaby. Outside, the sky darkened, and a few early stars appeared, each one a tiny light holding steady in the vastness. That night, as Morty lay in bed, he imagined the motes of light drifting above his fingertip, the glass sphere's aurora slowing under his breath. He realized he didn't need to understand everything yet. It was enough to practice kindness in small ways, to let curiosity move at a gentle pace. The world, like the motes, would float with him if he held it softly enough. And somewhere in the garage, behind boxes and jars, the narrow door waited, still shimmering, still breathing, knowing the boy was learning the patience he would need before stepping through. Night had a different sound in Morty's room after he began spending time in the garage. The radiator ticked more slowly as if it too was drowsy. The street outside fell silent, except for an occasional car rolling past like a thought you almost forget. He lay in bed with the blanket drawn to his chin, eyes half closed, letting his mind drift. That was when he began to hear them, soft voices moving through the house the way warm air moves through the vents. They were not the ordinary murmurs of a television or his parents' footsteps. These were slower, rounder, spoken in tones that bent and stretched like the glow of a candle. They drifted up from somewhere below, perhaps the garage, perhaps a place farther than the garage could ever be. Morty would hold his breath to listen. Sometimes he thought he recognized Rick's voice, a gravelly undertone, a rhythm like screws turning, but it mingled with other voices he did not know, voices that carried the hush of oceans or the weight of distant mountains. He never caught whole sentences, only fragments, syllables that felt like shapes rather than words, soft consonants that left an echo in his chest. They did not make him afraid. They made him curious the way starlight does, distant but steady. Lying there, he pictured the vents not as metal ducts, but as tunnels of night leading to places without ceilings. The voices travelled along them like birds migrating at dusk, each carrying a piece of something vast. On some nights he imagined the voices were telling stories about him, tiny tales of a boy learning to hold light on his fingertip, of a sandwich with stars inside. On others he imagined they were describing worlds he might never see, forests under glass skies, rivers of sound, markets where time itself could be weighed. He didn't need to understand. The half-heard whispers gave him a sense of scale, as if his small bed floated inside an enormous, kindly darkness. Rick never mentioned the visitors. In daylight, the garage seemed ordinary again, tools in place, jars still glowing, but faint traces of other presences lingered, a second mug left out, a coat draped over a chair, a scent of pine or ozone that didn't belong to any soap in the house, Morty noticed without pointing it out. Part of him liked the secrecy. It felt like being allowed to glimpse a hidden kindness in his grandfather that most people never saw. Once, when the voices came especially clearly, he sat up and pressed his ear to the vent above his desk. He could hear Rick speaking in a low, almost gentle tone he'd never heard before, like a lullaby spoken instead of sung. The other voice replied in slow pulses, not words but hums that rose and fell. The pattern reminded Morty of the motes of light drifting in the dish, rising and settling with his breath. Without meaning to, he slowed his own breathing to match the rhythm. The room softened. The whispers became part of his heartbeat. After that night, he began a quiet ritual. Before sleep, he would sit cross-legged on his bed, eyes closed, listening for the first faint trickle of sound. He didn't strain. He simply waited, hands resting on his knees, palms open. Sometimes no voices came at all. Sometimes they came in a rush, like leaves blowing past. He accepted both. This patience made him feel older than he was, like someone keeping watch at the edge of a village. Little by little, the whispers shaped him. He found himself speaking more softly to classmates, listening longer before replying. He noticed how people's tones carried hidden meanings the way the voices in the vents carried hidden worlds. He began to believe that kindness might be a kind of science too, a discipline of attention, of holding space for what can't yet be explained. On one especially still night, a single phrase reached him whole. It wasn't in any language he knew, yet it bloomed in his mind as an image, a star cupped in a pair of hands, safe and unburning. The feeling of it stayed with him long after the sound faded. He thought of Rick again, his rough hands fixing fragile things, his gruff words hiding something softer. Morty smiled in the dark. He drifted to sleep, imagining the vents above him opening like petals, revealing a night sky threaded through the house. He pictured unseen visitors perched there, speaking gently so as not to wake anyone but him. And he pictured himself answering not with words, but with steady breathing, as if to say, "I'm listening. I'm learning." In the mornings he would wake to ordinary sunlight, his ceiling plain and white, the vent just a vent again. But the echoes of the night whispers stayed like the taste of a dream. They made the day seem larger, as though every classroom, every hallway, held invisible corridors to elsewhere. He carried the feeling quietly, the way one carries a smooth stone in a pocket for comfort. The voices through the vents did not teach him formulas or show him gadgets. They taught him something subtler, that the universe was both enormous and intimate, capable of reaching a boy's room in the hush before sleep. And they taught him that hidden inside even the roughest voice there might be a thread of lullaby. That night, as he curled under the blanket, Morty placed his hand over his heart and whispered back into the darkness, not words, but a simple exhale. Somewhere below, a low hum answered. He closed his eyes and let the sound guide him into dreams where ceilings dissolved and stars swayed like lanterns above a quiet path. Morty first noticed her because she was always near a window. In every classroom she chose the seat where light spilled in across her desk, a quiet stripe of sky breaking the beige walls. She didn't raise her hand much. When teachers called on her, she answered with phrases that sounded as if they had floated in from somewhere else. Soft, sideways things like "clouds like pages" or "the bell feels tired today." The other kids would glance at each other, half smiling, not unkind, but unsure what to make of her. Morty simply listened. At lunch, she sat alone near the back, a sandwich untouched, tracing invisible shapes on the tabletop. He remembered the stars inside his own sandwich and felt a strange tug, like recognition before introduction. One day he walked over and sat across from her without saying anything. She looked up, startled but not afraid. Her eyes were a color he couldn't quite name, not blue, not gray, but the soft shade of evening before the first street lamp turns on. For a while they just sat. Morty unwrapped his lunch slowly, the way he did in the garage with delicate things. She tilted her head toward the window and said quietly, "The air feels like it's waiting for something." It wasn't a question. He didn't answer. He only nodded. Something in his chest loosened. He didn't need to translate her words. He understood their shape, the feeling underneath. That was enough. The next day she spoke again, this time about a dream of walking on bridges made of glass threads, of carrying a lantern with a heartbeat. Morty listened, elbows tucked in, and felt the images settle around him like soft dust. He didn't know if the dream was real or a story. It didn't matter. The important thing was the tone, a quiet offering, like holding out a fragile bead for someone else to see. He found himself replying not with stories but with small gestures, sliding his apple across the table, pointing out the faint rainbow on the classroom wall when sunlight hit a prism. Days passed, and a pattern grew between them. She would speak in fragments. "The hallway smells of rain," or "today feels like a forgotten song," and Morty would meet her eyes, sometimes nodding, sometimes drawing a shape with his finger on the desk to mirror hers. He didn't realize it yet, but he was practicing the same attention he gave the motes of light in the garage, creating a space where something delicate could float without falling. Once, during a quiet afternoon, she handed him a folded scrap of paper. Inside was a sketch of a window with stars spilling through it like water. Beneath, she had written, "Some nights I think the sky is breathing." Morty read it twice. He didn't try to explain or improve it. He simply folded it back and placed it gently in his pocket, as if it were one of his grandfather's glowing beads. That evening, he tucked it under his pillow and fell asleep, imagining the stars flowing into his room, the sky breathing slow. Their conversations stayed small, never turning into the chatter he heard from other classmates. Yet each exchange left a calmness in him that lingered after the bell rang. He began to notice that her phrases weren't random. They followed the quiet weather of the day, the tilt of the light, the mood of the hallways. She was speaking a language of atmospheres. Without trying, Morty was learning it. One rainy morning, as they stood by the classroom window watching water bead on the glass, She whispered, "Sometimes I think everything is a dream and we're just walking through someone else's story." Morty looked at her, then at the rain, and said softly, "Maybe, but dreams can be kind." It was the first time he'd answered in words. She smiled, a small, surprised curve of her lips, as if he had touched a hidden thread. The smile stayed with him all day. He found himself bringing small things to show her, a marble from his drawer, a feather he'd found on the sidewalk. He didn't explain where they came from. He just placed them on the desk between them, and she would trace them with her fingertips as if reading Braille. Sometimes she closed her eyes while she did this, and he wondered what pictures bloomed in her mind. He didn't ask. He liked the mystery. Through these quiet exchanges, Morty discovered a new part of himself. In the garage, he had learned how to steady motes of light. With her, he was learning how to steady feelings. He realized he could understand hearts before words, not by guessing thoughts, but by offering space. He didn't have to fix or decode anything. He only had to listen the way he listened to the whispers through the vents at night. One afternoon, the classroom emptied early for an assembly. They stayed behind, the light slanting gold across the desks. She looked at him and said, "Do you ever hear things in the walls?" Morty felt a small shiver. He thought of Rick's late-night visitors, of voices drifting through the vents. "Sometimes," he said quietly. "They're not scary, though." She nodded, her eyes bright but calm. "I think they're telling stories," she murmured. "I think they're kind," Morty smiled. "Me too." In that moment, he understood something he couldn't yet put into words. That kindness could travel like whispers through unseen channels, reaching people who needed it without fanfare, and that maybe, just maybe, his grandfather's world of hidden inventions and drifting stars wasn't separate from the small, fragile world of his classroom. It was all one fabric, and he was learning to touch it gently. When the bell for the assembly finally rang, they stood together by the window a moment longer, watching the last drops slide down the glass. She turned to him and said, "The rain sounds like it's clapping softly for us." He laughed under his breath, a quiet, surprised laugh. They walked out side by side, not holding hands but matching steps, like two motes of light drifting in the same current. That night, as Morty lay in bed, the vent above him hummed faintly. He closed his eyes and pictured the girl at the window, her dreamlike phrases trailing like ribbons in the dark. He felt a warm glow in his chest, not excitement, but a steady ember. The whispers and the girl's words mingled in his mind, weaving a new motif he didn't yet understand. He smiled into the pillow, breathing slowly, and drifted into sleep with the image of stars spilling through a window, filling the room with quiet light. It arrived without ceremony, the way rain begins with a single drop. Morty came into the garage after school, the smell of sawdust and warm metal already familiar now, and found Rick seated at the bench with his back turned. The old man's hands moved slowly over a small brass circle, wiping it with a cloth as if it was something alive. He didn't glance up when Morty entered. He just kept polishing until the brass caught the dim light and glowed like a quiet sun. Rick set the object on the bench between them. It was a pocket watch, heavy and plain, its cover etched not with strange symbols, but with a soft pattern of concentric circles, like ripples after a stone touches water. "For you?" he said, as if it were a screwdriver or a spare key. His voice was flat, but Morty felt something behind it, a pause that didn't usually live there. He picked up the watch carefully. It was cool in his palm, heavier than it looked. The ticking inside was slow, not the quick, nervous tick of most clocks, but a round, unhurried sound, like someone breathing in their sleep. Morty clicked the cover open. The face was simple, no glowing runes, no extra hands, just two delicate needles and numbers printed in faded ink. But as he watched, he saw the second hand drift a little slower than it should, as though the watch was savoring each moment instead of counting it. Rick leaned back, sipping from a mug. "It runs different at night," he muttered. "Slower." "Don't try to fix it." Morty nodded, unsure what to say. He felt the same stillness he'd felt with the motes of light, the same quiet he'd found at the window with the girl. This was no gadget for jumping through portals. This was something that asked him to wait. That evening he carried the watch in his pocket, the brass warm against his leg. At dinner he could feel its gentle weight, a secret rhythm beneath the clatter of dishes and voices. Afterward, in his room, he set it on the windowsill and watched the numbers glow faintly in the dusk. The second hand moved as if wading through honey. Outside, the first star blinked on. Morty lay back and listened. The watch's slow tick matched his breath. He thought about how often Rick's inventions raced ahead, flashes of light, sudden leaps, shouts of "Hurry!" This was different. This was a gift that turned time into a lullaby. He closed his eyes and imagined the hands of the watch sweeping over a vast calm sea, drawing long arcs that left no wake. On school mornings he tucked the watch under his shirt, feeling its steady presence. It didn't make him faster or smarter. It made him aware. Waiting in line, sitting through long lectures, walking home through crowded halls, everything felt less like a blur and more like a slow stream he could step into without getting lost. He began to notice small things: a pencil rolling to the edge of a desk, a classmate's sigh, sunlight shifting across the floor. Time, he realized, was full of hidden rooms when you didn't rush through it. Sometimes at night, he would hold the watch open and whisper to it the way he whispered to the motes of light. He didn't know why. He just liked the feeling of speaking into a rhythm that would not answer back, but also would not leave. The tick was steady, patient, unjudging. He wondered if Rick had built it or found it, and what nights had been slow for him. One weekend afternoon, Rick caught Morty staring at the watch while a small gadget spun on the bench. "You can't make time behave," he said gruffly. "But you can decide how to stand in it." Morty looked up, startled. Rick's eyes softened for an instant before he turned away. That was all the explanation offered, and all Morty needed. The watch began to appear in his dreams. He would see it hanging in the sky like a small golden moon, its hands sweeping slowly while stars drifted past. Sometimes the girl from the window of dreams stood beneath it, her palms open, waiting. Sometimes the voices through the vents whispered in time with its tick. The images blended, soft motifs looping back into each other, as if the watch was stitching his days together with a single patient thread. He started sharing the watch's slowness in small ways. When a classmate dropped a stack of papers, Morty bent to help without hurry, stacking them neatly instead of shoving them back. When his sister asked him a question, he paused before answering, giving her words space to land. The world didn't change, but it seemed to breathe easier around him. He realized patience wasn't empty. It was full of quiet acts. One night, unable to sleep, Morty sat at his desk with the watch open in front of him. The second hand crept like a lazy comet. Outside, the streetlight flickered. He thought about the garage, the sandwich with stars, the girl's dream phrases, the whispers through the vents. All of it felt connected by this slow tick, as if his grandfather had given him not just a watch, but a way of being. He rested his chin on his arms and let the rhythm carry him into drowsiness. Downstairs, the house shifted, pipes settling, maybe Rick moving in the kitchen. Morty imagined the old man awake, tinkering quietly, leaving a mug for an unseen visitor. He wondered if Rick knew the watch's tick was shaping him. He decided it didn't matter. Gifts don't always need explanations. Some are meant to be lived with until you understand them from the inside out. The watch lay warm under his palm, each tick a soft footstep into deeper rest. Morty closed his eyes, breathing with it, feeling the night stretch like a long corridor where no one needed to rush. And in that corridor, patience was not waiting for something to begin. Patience was already the journey. It was early evening when Morty noticed the shimmer at the edge of the yard. The sun had just set, and the grass still held a faint glow of warmth, but in the far corner near the lilac bushes, something flickered like a candle inside glass. He stepped outside, the screen door whispering shut behind him. The air smelled of earth, cooling after heat, and of something faintly sweet, like fruit left in the fridge too long. He walked slowly, palms open, the way he did when approaching shy animals. Crouched in the grass was a creature no bigger than a kitten. Its skin was translucent blue, and a thin frill ran from the top of its head to its tail like a folded ribbon. Two wide eyes blinked up at him, not fearful exactly, but unsure. It gave a tiny sound somewhere between a sigh and a note played on a glass rim. Morty felt his chest soften. He knelt, careful not to startle it, and whispered, "Hey there." The creature tilted its head. A bead of light rolled off its frill and fell onto the grass, fading into the soil like dew. Morty remembered the motes of light he had steadied on his fingertip. He slowed his breathing. He didn't reach out yet. He just let the silence hold them both until the creature's quivering eased a little. He glanced back at the house. Rick's voice drifted faintly from the garage, muttering to himself over some project. Morty could have called for him, but something in him said not to. This was small, and it was his. He scanned the yard for clues. Faint footprints in the dirt, a trail of those light beads leading to a gap in the fence. The creature must have slipped through from somewhere beyond. Its frill fluttered like a leaf in breeze. Morty whispered again, "You're okay." "Let's get you home." He lowered his hand to the grass, palm up. The creature hesitated, then crept forward a fraction, its tiny toes leaving faint glowing prints. Morty stayed still. The evening light deepened. The first stars appeared overhead. He thought of the girl at the window, of the pocket watch ticking slowly under his shirt. He let time stretch. After a moment, the creature stepped onto his hand, its body cool and surprisingly light, like holding a puddle of moonlight. Morty rose carefully, cupping his other hand above it as a roof. The creature made a soft, humming sound. He followed the trail of fading light beads to the gap in the fence, a slat missing near the bottom. Beyond lay the neighbor's overgrown lot, but as Morty crouched, he saw something else, a faint shimmer in the air, like heat above asphalt, forming a small oval just off the ground. Through it glowed a dim bluish forest, mist curling between trees. The creature gave a low trill. Morty knelt and held his hands toward the shimmer. It pulsed once, as if recognizing a password. The oval widened a little, enough for the tiny being to slip through. Morty tilted his hands and the creature stepped off, pausing to look back at him with its wide eyes. For a heartbeat, Morty felt the same vast kindness he'd felt in the whispers through the vents, a sense of something enormous bending down to notice a boy's backyard. The creature made another sound, not a word, but something like gratitude felt directly in the chest. Then it vanished into the mist, and the oval closed like a sigh. Morty stayed crouched there, palms empty but warm. The grass smelled of lilacs and night. He thought about how easily he could have rushed or shouted or tried to hold on. Instead, he had just made a small, safe path. It didn't feel like an accomplishment. It felt like a lesson settling quietly into him, like dust in a sunbeam, a lesson in small rescues. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and looked up at the sky. The first real star of the night shone faintly above the roofline. He remembered the sandwich with stars, the girl's sketches, the slow tick of the watch. All these gentle motifs seemed to weave together here. Patience, attention, kindness without spectacle. He whispered, "Good night," to no one in particular, and turned back toward the house. Inside, the kitchen light was on. He washed his hands at the sink, the water cool over his palms. Through the window, he thought he saw a last flicker near the fence, like a thank you written in light. Then gone. He smiled and dried his hands slowly, savoring the quiet. Rick's voice still muttered faintly from the garage. Morty slipped the watch from his pocket and listened to its slow tick, feeling it match his heartbeat. That night, lying in bed, he pictured the tiny being stepping into its misty forest. He pictured it safe, maybe telling its own kind of story about a boy with careful hands. He drifted to sleep with that image, the vent above him humming softly, the night stretching wide and patient around his small, kind act. The night after the small rescue, Morty returned to the garage as though drawn by a thread. The shelves glowed faintly, tools resting like tired birds, and Rick stood bent over a plate of swirling green light. He didn't look up. "If you're coming, come now," he said softly, almost absently. Morty felt no jolt of excitement, only a slow curiosity, like opening a window you've always seen but never touched. On the workbench, a small portal shimmered, no larger than a mirror, its edges fraying into soft gold. It didn't whirl or spark. It drifted like the surface of a pond, candlelight sliding across its ripples. Morty stepped closer and felt cool air brush his face, smelling of pine and paper, as if someone had left books open in a forest. Rick said nothing more. He only nodded once, a gesture that held both permission and warning. Morty slipped a hand through. It felt like water that remembered being air. He breathed once, twice, then stepped forward, the garage falling behind him as if it was simply the next room. There was no jolt or roar, just a gentle shift like turning a page. He stood on an island no bigger than his school's playground. The ground was soft, almost spongy, with patterns like faded carpet underfoot. All around stretched a sky of muted gold and violet, candle-lit clouds drifting without hurry. In the distance, other islands floated, some small as chairs, some wide as fields, connected by narrow ribbons of light that looked like footpaths spun from glass. Everything moved at a pace that felt familiar, like the slow tick of the pocket watch in his pocket. Morty walked forward, hands loose at his sides. The air was warm and quiet, carrying a scent of rain after a library. No wind, only a faint hush, as if the whole place were listening. He stepped onto a ribbon of light and felt it hold his weight. Not solid exactly, but steady enough, like standing on a memory. As he walked, he noticed objects on the island. A chair with no legs, a lantern burning with a steady blue flame, a tree whose leaves resembled folded letters. Each thing glowed faintly as though lit from inside by stories. He didn't touch anything. He simply let his eyes linger, taking in the softness. He thought of the girl at the window of dreams, of her phrases about bridges of glass threads, of carrying a lantern with a heartbeat. This place felt like an echo of her words, a dreamscape he'd stepped into rather than fled toward. He paused on one of the larger islands. A pool of still water lay at its center, reflecting not the candlelight sky, but a scene from his own backyard, the lilac bushes, the gap in the fence, the shimmer where the timid creature had been. He knelt, watching the reflection shift slowly like a film run at half speed. He felt no urge to reach in, only to watch. The pool seemed to breathe. From somewhere behind him came a faint hum. Rick stood at the edge of the island, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. He looked less like an inventor here, and more like a traveler passing through a familiar station. He didn't speak. Morty realized this was not a lesson or a test. It was an invitation to see. They moved together along another ribbon of light. Overhead, the candle-lit clouds drifted lower, their glow brushing Morty's shoulders like warm cloth. He could almost hear whispers within them, not words, but tones, the same slow pulses he'd once heard through the vents at night. The sound calmed him. He walked slower, breathing with it, the watch ticking softly against his chest. At the far edge of the floating archipelago, they reached a narrow ledge where the ribbons converged into a single beam. Beyond, lay a vast, open space filled with drifting lanterns, each one the size of a person's palm, bobbing in invisible water. Morty reached out to one. It hovered near his hand, glowing steady. Inside, he saw a tiny version of his kitchen table, sunlight striping the wood. The image faded when he blinked, replaced by something he didn't recognize, a hallway lined with shelves of jars, like the garage, but larger, endless. He let the lantern drift on. He felt a strange familiarity, as if he'd been here in dreams before the sandwich, before the watch, before the girl's phrases. It didn't feel like running away. It felt like stepping sideways into a place that had been waiting, patient, holding his memories gently. A place without urgency, where nothing asked him to be more than he was. Rick finally spoke, his voice low. "Sometimes places remember you before you remember them." Morty nodded. The words felt true without needing explanation. They stood side by side, watching the lanterns drift past like slow comets. The boy felt small but not lost, like a single note in a kind song. After a long while, Rick touched his shoulder and gestured back toward the first island. Morty followed. The ribbons of light glowed brighter under their feet, leading them gently. When they stepped back through the small portal, the garage was as they'd left it, tools resting, jars glowing. Only the scent of pine and paper lingered, fading with each breath. Morty looked around, then at Rick. The old man gave a slight nod and turned back to his work. No explanation, no question. Morty slipped the watch from his pocket and listened to its slow tick, matching it to the hush he'd carried back inside him. He felt as though he'd visited not another universe, but a memory wearing the shape of one. That night, in his room, he lay awake a while longer than usual. The vent hummed faintly above him. He closed his eyes and pictured the candle-lit sky, the floating islands, the pool reflecting his backyard. He thought about how sometimes stepping out of reality could bring you closer to yourself rather than farther away. His breathing slowed. The watch ticked on his bedside table. He drifted to sleep, feeling as though he was still walking that ribbon of light, not escaping, but arriving somewhere quietly, his own. The next time Morty followed Rick through the garage portal, the air felt even softer, as though the world on the other side had been waiting for them. The candle-lit sky glowed a deeper gold, and the ribbons of light stretched farther than before, like threads unspooling from an unseen loom. They crossed in silence until the floating islands gave way to a single vast platform shaped like a page half-turned. On its surface rose an archway of pale stone, carved with no symbols at all, only blank panels, as if expecting something yet to be written. Morty hesitated at the threshold. The air here smelled of paper, just before ink touches it. Rick gestured him forward without a word. Inside, the light dimmed into a warm hush. Shelves spiraled upward, higher than Morty could see, holding not books but rolled scrolls. Half-sketched diagrams pinned under glass, jars of faintly glowing dust, and tools he did not recognize resting as if asleep. The whole place felt like a library of ideas that had stopped just short of becoming real. A figure stepped from behind a stack. It wasn't human in any ordinary way, but neither alien in a frightening sense. Its outline flickered between genders and ages, like a candle's shadow on a wall. Eyes calm as deep water regarded him. The caretaker wore a robe the color of dried leaves, and when it spoke, the voice came softly from several directions at once, low and even. "Welcome to the unwritten." Morty's mouth opened, but no words came. The caretaker inclined its head, then motioned him to follow along a narrow aisle where diagrams glowed faintly on parchment. Morty peered at one, a device shaped like a spiral shell with a single pulse of light in its center. "It listens," the caretaker said, "and turns harsh words into warmth." On the next shelf lay a blueprint for a machine no bigger than a bird, its wings annotated with tiny symbols. "It mends broken echoes," the caretaker murmured. Each drawing carried notes of care rather than conquest, things to soothe, to repair, to listen, to slow. Morty felt his heart beat softer. They reached a round table at the center of the library. Upon it lay a single empty page. The caretaker gestured to it. Here are the inventions that have not yet found hands gentle enough to build them. Morty stared at the blank page and felt a tremor of recognition, as though all his small experiments, the motes of light, the patient watch, the rescued creature, had been preparing him to understand this emptiness. It wasn't absence. It was invitation. Rick remained near the doorway, silent, watching. His eyes held a glint of something Morty rarely saw there. Pride, maybe, or a quiet ache. The caretaker placed a palm over Morty's small hand. Its skin felt like cool paper.
"Every blueprint here," it whispered, "began as a kindness someone imagined but never finished."
Some need time. Some need patience. Some need a child's way of listening. Morty's eyes stung a little. He thought of the girl at the window, of her dream phrases, of how he'd understood her without decoding. He thought of the alien creature in his backyard, of returning it without claim. All these moments lined up like faint lines on a drawing, forming something he hadn't seen until now. The caretaker reached for a scroll and unfurled it just enough for Morty to glimpse a shape, a small device with a soft glow, like a lantern cupped in two hands. "This one," the caretaker said, "is meant to teach the difference between holding and keeping." Morty didn't fully understand, but he felt its truth in his chest, the way one feels a lullaby rather than hears it. They walked slowly among more shelves. Morty noticed how the caretaker's fingers brushed each diagram as if greeting it. He mirrored the gesture without thinking, fingertips hovering above the glass, protecting a sketch of a time garden where moments could grow slower until they blossomed into rest. He whispered the words under his breath and smiled. He didn't feel like an inventor. He felt like a gardener tending seeds he couldn't yet see. At last they returned to the round table. The caretaker placed a small crystal on the blank page. It pulsed once, faint and blue, then settled into stillness.
"A seed," it said.
"Not to take, only to remember." Morty cupped it in his hands for a moment. It wasn't cold or warm. It felt like possibility. He set it back gently, understanding the rule without being told. Rick cleared his throat softly, the sound oddly respectful. The caretaker inclined its head to him, then to Morty. "Keep practicing small rescues," it murmured. "They are the blueprints." Then it stepped back, fading slightly, as though merging with the shelves. On their walk back through the archway, Morty held the slow tick of his pocket watch against his chest, feeling how its rhythm matched the hush of the library. He glanced up at Rick. "Why didn't you show me this before?" he asked. Rick shrugged, not unkindly. "You weren't listening yet." Morty nodded. The answer felt simple and whole. They crossed the ribbon of light back toward the portal. The candle-lit sky stretched above, islands drifting like thoughts not yet spoken. Morty felt no rush to leave. He understood now that stepping into other places didn't have to be about escape or conquest. It could be about visiting a memory of what could be, learning to hold it softly, then returning home with its echo. Back in the garage, the smell of pine and paper faded. The jars glowed faintly as always. Rick busied himself with tools. Morty sat on the stool a moment longer, eyes closed, feeling the library's warmth still around him. He imagined the caretaker moving among its shelves, waiting, tending. He thought of the blank page at the center, and how it had felt not empty, but alive. That night, he fell asleep with the pocket watch in his palm. The tick matched his breathing. In his dream, the shelves of the library curved into the horizon, filled with inventions like small lanterns waiting to be built. He saw himself walking among them, not as a thief or a genius, but as a listener. And in the dream, somewhere beyond the rows of scrolls, a A voice like paper turning whispered, "Keep practicing." It was a grey morning when Morty found the toy again. He had been cleaning the bottom drawer of his desk, sorting through pencils and folded notes, when his fingers closed around a small plastic spaceship with one wing snapped off. He remembered it instantly, a birthday gift from years ago before the garage, before the sandwich with stars. He had flown it in circles around his room until the wing cracked and fell away. He had meant to fix it, but never did. Now it felt light and brittle in his palm, a fragment of a smaller self. He carried it to the kitchen without thinking. Rick sat at the table, hunched over a mug, eyes still half hidden behind his hair. Morty set the toy down softly near his elbow. Rick didn't look up, just grunted, but his hand drifted toward the spaceship, fingers brushing the jagged break. Morty poured himself cereal, not watching, though his ears tilted toward the sound of tools being lifted from Rick's coat pocket. All day, the toy disappeared. Morty didn't ask where it went. He went to school, sat near the girl at the window, heard her whisper that the clouds looked like slow ships today. He nodded, fingers resting on the empty space in his backpack where the toy had been. The absence felt like a quiet question. When he returned home, the garage door was half open. Inside, Rick stood at the bench, the toy on a square of cloth under a small beam of light. No sparks, no gadgets, no muttering, just a soldering iron cooling in its stand, a magnifier pushed aside. Rick's shoulders were hunched, not with his usual restless energy, but with stillness, like a craftsman finishing the last stitch of a secret. He stepped back, wiped his hands on a rag, and left without a word. Morty approached. The spaceship looked whole again. The broken wing was attached not with shiny glue or glowing welds, but seamlessly, as though it had never snapped. The plastic gleamed faintly. He picked it up carefully. It was warm from being held. When he tilted it, the tiny cockpit light flickered back to life, a soft, yellow pulse. A smell of pine and oil clung to it, the same scent the garage sometimes had after Rick worked late. He sat on the stool, turning the toy slowly in his hands. No note, no explanation, no lecture. Just a repaired thing, offered back into his life like a quiet apology. Morty felt a small weight lift from somewhere behind his ribs. This was not an apology in the language of words, but in the language he was learning to read, the language of mended edges, of patience poured into something fragile. He flew the toy gently through the air above the bench. The light in the cockpit blinked in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. He thought of the library of unwritten inventions, of the caretaker showing blueprints for devices that healed instead of harmed. This was one of them, in its own way, an old toy repaired, carrying forward a piece of childhood without erasing the break. Rick reappeared at the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't look directly at Morty. "Found some spare parts?" he muttered, voice neutral. Morty nodded, still tracing the toy's smooth wing.
"Thanks," he said softly. Rick gave a quick shrug and went back to the kitchen.
The door swung half shut behind him, leaving the smell of warm plastic and solder. Morty stayed in the garage a little longer, letting the repaired toy rest on his palm. The pocket watch ticked slowly in his pocket. He realized the watch and the toy were teaching him the same lesson, that not everything precious had to be replaced or improved. Some things could be held, waited for, then quietly mended when the time was right. He felt a soft gratitude spread through him, not only for the toy, but for the gesture inside it. A glimpse of the grandfather who built devices and left mugs for unseen visitors, and sometimes, silently, fixed a broken piece of a boy's childhood. That evening, after dinner, Morty sat on his bed turning the spaceship between his fingers. The girl at the window had once said that clouds looked like slow ships. He thought about how this toy was like a tiny cloud caught and held, drifting now in his room. He felt himself breathing slower, matching the cockpit light's pulse.
Outside, the vent hummed faintly.
Somewhere downstairs, Rick's mug clinked against the counter. No words passed between them, but a small current of understanding moved quietly through the house. Before sleep, Morty placed the toy on his nightstand beside the pocket watch. The two objects glowed faintly in the low light, one ticking, one pulsing, like a duet. He closed his eyes with a small smile. In his dream, he would be flying the toy again, but slowly, through candle-lit skies over drifting islands, carrying nothing but the quiet knowledge that sometimes love comes as a mended wing.
Handed back without explanation, it began as a dream that did not feel like a dream.
Morty was lying in his room, the pocket watch ticking softly on the nightstand, the mended toy spaceship resting beside it. The vent above him hummed a low, steady note. He closed his eyes and drifted, and then the sound of his own breathing shifted, longer, rounder, as if another heartbeat had joined his. When he opened his eyes again, he was still in a room, but not quite his room. The walls were softer, painted with faint constellations. A chair sat near the bed, and someone sat in it reading aloud. The voice reached him before the sight. It was his voice, older, lower, but carrying the same careful pauses he used when speaking to the timid creature or the girl at the window. The older Morty held a book on his lap, pages wide, and his hands moved gently as he turned them. On the bed lay a small figure, maybe a child, maybe just a bundle of listening, its eyes half closed, breathing slow. The story was soft, the words simple but warm. They drifted like feathers, settling into the quiet. Young Morty stood at the edge of the room, unseen, listening. He felt no rush of pride or disbelief, only a calm recognition, like seeing a path he'd been walking without knowing. The older Morty read a line about lanterns in the sky, about patience as a kind of bridge. He smiled down at the listener, smoothing the blanket once, then went on. The book's cover glowed faintly as though lit from within by memory. The room smelled of tea and rain. A clock ticked somewhere, slow and steady. Morty realized it was the same pocket watch, now scratched but still running, resting on a shelf beside a row of small objects. A marble, a feather, a repaired toy spaceship. Each one was something he had held gently once. Each one a seed of kindness planted in his days. The sight made his chest ache in a soft, pleasant way. This was legacy, not as trophies or stories told about him, but as a quiet thread passed from hand to hand, from voice to ear. The older Morty paused, looking at the listener, and for a moment his eyes flicked toward the corner of the room where the younger Morty stood. Their gazes almost met. In that instant, the boy felt an echo move through him. Not words, but a sensation, like warm water poured into his heart. He understood without explanation. You are already becoming this. You are already learning how to hold someone else's night gently. He thought of Rick's silent repairs, of the caretaker's blueprints, of the girl's dream phrases. All of it was practice for this moment, not for adventures across galaxies, but for the simple act of being present for another soul at the edge of sleep. He felt a ripple of gratitude toward the older self, toward the unseen listener, toward the long, slow arc that had carried him here. The scene faded gently, like mist burned off by morning light. The older Morty turned a page, his voice still drifting, but the walls blurred, the chair softened, the clock tick slowed until it was only the boy's own heartbeat again. He woke in his bed, the vent humming softly, the watch ticking beside the spaceship. Outside, dawn pressed a pale glow against the curtains. He lay still, breathing slowly. He didn't feel the urge to tell anyone about the vision. It wasn't a prophecy, not exactly. It was a glimpse of continuity, the echo of his own voice traveling ahead of him, returning as a lullaby. He rolled onto his side and watched the faint light on the wall, thinking about how legacies could be built without noise, in small, steady acts of care, each one a line in an unwritten story. Before rising, he reached for the watch and the toy, holding them both in his palms. He whispered into the quiet, not to himself, but to the future listener he had seen. "Sleep well." The words felt right, like planting a seed. He placed the objects back on the nightstand, the watch ticking its patient rhythm. Then he closed his eyes for a few more minutes, letting the echo of his own voice drift through him like a soft tide. Knowing that somewhere ahead he would be sitting in that chair, turning pages, reading softly into someone else's night. It began on a night that felt like a sigh. The air was heavy with the scent of lilacs and cool grass, and a low silver glow drifted over the neighborhood, like milk poured slowly into dark tea. Morty had slipped out of the house without shoes, following a shimmer above the yard. His classmate, the girl at the window of dreams, was already there, standing barefoot at the fence line, looking up. The sky above them wasn't quite the sky they knew. It had softened, turned deeper, as if the night itself had exhaled and loosened. From that velvet expanse, tiny moons began to fall. Not meteors, not stones, but miniature silver orbs the size of marbles, gliding down like dandelion seeds. They landed soundlessly on the grass, leaving no mark, glowing faintly as though reflecting someone's hidden lantern. Morty crouched and reached for one. It was cool and weightless in his palm, lighter than a tear, smooth as a bead of glass. When he held it closer, he thought he saw mountains and seas etched on its surface like a toy planet asleep. The girl knelt beside him, cupping her hands under another falling moon. "They don't break," she whispered, her voice soft as drifting snow. Morty nodded. He didn't ask where they came from. He simply began to gather them, moving slowly, palms open as if collecting spilled pearls from a tide pool. The grass dampened their knees. The night hummed faintly. Perhaps the vent's lullaby had followed him outside. They moved together without hurry, scooping the little moons into a shallow basket she had brought from her room. Each orb pulsed once when touched, a tiny heartbeat, then settled. Morty felt the same patience he'd learned with the motes of light and the watch's slow tick. He breathed carefully, letting the moons roll gently against his fingers. The girl smiled without looking at him, her hair catching the silver glow. He felt warmth in his chest, not excitement, but a steady ember. At one point, a moon landed in the fold of her sleeve. She held it up and whispered something he couldn't hear. The orb brightened, then dimmed, as if answering. Morty realized she spoke their language instinctively, dreamlike phrases that met the moons halfway. He didn't try to copy her. He simply listened, letting the sound of her voice mingle with the hush of falling light. As the basket filled, they began arranging the moons in quiet patterns. Spirals, lines, clusters shaped like constellations. When placed together, the orbs glimmered in slow rhythms like a soft chord played on a hidden instrument. The grass beneath them stayed cool, the scent of lilac deepening. Morty lost track of time. The pocket watch in his shirt ticked a little slower, as if bowing to the moment. When the rain eased, they sat cross-legged facing each other, the basket of tiny moons between them. Neither spoke. The girl traced a finger through the glow, drawing a circle, then another inside it. Morty mirrored her gesture on the grass, making a soft groove with his fingertip. Above them, the real moon hung pale and large, watching. He thought of the caretaker's library of inventions meant to heal instead of harm. He thought of Rick's mended toy, of the gentle creatures he'd met. All these moments felt like practice for this. Sitting quietly, holding a universe small enough to fit in their hands, the girl finally whispered, "They'll fade by morning." Morty nodded, feeling no sadness.
"That's okay," he said.
We saw them. They began releasing the moons back onto the grass. One by one, the orbs rolled away, lifting into the air like bubbles and drifting upward until they vanished into the deep, violet sky. Morty watched until the last faint glow disappeared, leaving only the ordinary stars. He felt his shoulders loosen, a soft exhale inside him. They sat a little longer, listening to crickets and the faraway hum of a car on the road. The grass cooled under their legs. The girl leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, not as a claim, but as a quiet thanks. He stayed still, letting the weight settle like a bird landing briefly. In the hush, he realized that bonding didn't need grand gestures. Sometimes it was just collecting fallen moons together and letting them go. When they finally rose, the basket was empty, faintly silvered by residue of light. They walked back toward their houses side by side, steps slow as if not to wake the ground. At the door, she turned and gave him a small smile. "Good night, Moon Collector," she murmured. Morty smiled back. "Good night," he said. No promises, no plans. Just a soft farewell. In his room, he placed the basket on the floor. It looked like any other basket now, but his hands still carried the cool memory of the tiny moons. He set the pocket watch on his nightstand. Its tick matched the fading echo of the falling light. He lay back, eyes half closed, breathing slow. He pictured the orbs drifting upward, returning to whatever sky had sent them, and felt a gentle gratitude. The girl at the window, the caretaker, the mended toy, all threads weaving into one soft motif of release. As he drifted towards sleep, he imagined a future night when someone else, small and curious, might find him sitting under a sky of tiny moons. He would smile and hand them a basket. He would say nothing at first, just let them collect and release, teaching with silence. The thought soothed him like a lullaby. He closed his eyes and let the dream come, slow and silver, carrying him deeper into rest. The morning was soft, not sharp, as though the sun had been waiting in a quiet room before spilling across the neighborhood. Morty's room smelled faintly of lilacs from the night before, of grass pressed under tiny moons that no longer glimmered. On his nightstand, the pocket watch ticked its slow rhythm, the seconds folding over each other like whispers. He picked it up carefully, turning it in his hands, feeling the cool metal, the tiny hands that moved differently at night. The watch was not magic in the way the portal gun or falling moons had been. It was simpler, subtler. It taught patience. It taught letting time stretch, breathe and fold, like a secret that only a careful listener could understand. For a moment, he imagined keeping it. Keeping it meant comfort, a little control over the relentless forward motion of mornings, afternoons, and the dim, lingering evenings. But he knew softly that comfort was not the point. The slowing watch had served its purpose, and he had learned. The lessons it held were already inside him: patience, attention, and the gentle shape of time when it is not demanded but observed. He remembered the timid alien from the backyard, the fallen moons, the girl at the window of dreams, each moment threading into a quiet tapestry of care. Perhaps someone else, someone wandering lost in the edges of the world, could use the watch now, as he had once needed guidance from the caretakers of unwritten inventions or Rick's quiet apologies. He dressed slowly, barefoot on the soft rug. The house was still. Even the humming refrigerator seemed to pause in respect. He tucked the watch into the pocket of his jacket, the weight of familiar comfort. Outside, the air was pale and gentle. It smelled like frost-touching leaves and dew on quiet lawns, like the sort of morning that lets you walk without thinking about where you are going. Morty wandered toward the edge of the neighborhood, past fences and hedges, past the faint hum of streetlights that were still unsure whether to leave or linger. He didn't look for anyone in particular. He only walked, letting his intuition carry him toward someone who might need time, a slow pocket of it as he had. He found the traveler sitting at the side of the road, knees drawn to chest, face hidden in folded arms. The figure shivered lightly in a coat that looked too thin, too small, a coat that seemed to have swallowed the warmth of its wearer. Morty approached cautiously, heart steady as though this moment had been waiting for him without needing urgency. He knelt a few feet away, not to startle. "Hi," he said softly. His voice was small but firm, carrying neither demand nor expectation. The traveller looked up slowly, eyes wide and uncertain. There was no need to speak more. Morty reached into his pocket and brought out the watch, holding it out in both hands like a small offering.
I think this might help," he said, voice lower still, almost a whisper. "It doesn't make the world stop."
"It only makes time gentle." The traveller blinked, hesitant, then leaned closer. Fingers trembled as they took the watch, feeling the cool weight, noticing the subtle difference in its tick. It was not loud, not insistent. It moved with a soft certainty, a rhythm that made breathing easier, even on anxious mornings. "Thank you," the traveller murmured. The words were small, unpolished, but they carried gratitude, not because the watch was valuable in the ordinary sense, but because it carried thoughtfulness, care, and the gift of patience. Morty nodded. There was no need to say more. The act itself, the quiet crossing of one hand to another, had said what needed saying. He lingered a moment, watching the traveller clasp the watch to their chest, feeling the tick under trembling fingers. Morty realized that generosity did not have to shout. It did not need fireworks or applause. The gentle transfer of something meaningful, the offering of attention, care, or time itself, was a heroism quieter than the storm of a battle or the sudden flash of a portal jump. It was the heroism that mattered in the slow, ordinary days, the kind that built worlds without leaving scars. Morty turned to leave, taking slow steps back along the same road he had followed. The morning seemed brighter, but not in a way that hurt the eyes. It was a soft illumination, like watching the first silver glimmer of frost on leaves or seeing a candle flicker in a window far away. His chest felt light, the subtle weight of the watch no longer pressing against him. He thought, without thinking, of Rick's quiet gestures, the repaired toy, the invisible kindnesses, the patience learned in small spaces. All of it, the slowing of watches, the gathering of moons, the tiny acts of care, wove together in a pattern that felt complete. Morty understood, in a way that was felt rather than articulated, that time, like love and attention, was not meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared, to be offered in quiet, in ways that could ripple far beyond the giver. The traveller's figure receded behind him, moving with steadier steps now, the watch held close. Morty allowed himself a small smile, almost imperceptible, as he wandered back toward home. The neighborhood hummed in gentle tones, leaves rustling, distant cars, the faint birdsong of an early morning. He felt the rhythm of life as a soft wave, carrying him with it rather than pulling or pushing. When he returned to his room, he placed the basket of tiny moons from the night before beside the windowsill, and for a moment imagined them drifting quietly among the stars again, no longer tethered to hands but free to wander. The watch was gone from his pocket, but the lesson remained. Patience, care, and release could travel further than anything else, touching lives without fanfare. Morty lay down on his bed, letting his eyelids rest heavy. The morning filtered in through thin curtains, painting the room in gentle strokes of light. He imagined the traveller somewhere beyond the hedges and fences, learning to move with the slow beat of the watch, discovering the same soft patience that had settled inside him over nights of tiny moons, whispered vents and quiet gifts. He thought briefly of the girl at the window of dreams, of the tender experiments of empathy disguised as science, of the worlds inside sandwiches, of whispers drifting through vents, of blueprints that healed, of small rescues and quiet apologies. Each memory was a note in a long, gentle chord. Morty exhaled slowly, feeling the music settle through him like a soft rain. Time had not stopped. It had only become gentle, and in that gentleness, Morty found the world held no hurry that mattered, no weight too heavy to lift with patience and care. He let his thoughts drift, untethered, toward the quiet, soft horizon of sleep, carrying with him the hum of a watch that no longer needed to tick for him to know its lesson. He closed his eyes, letting the lull of the morning fold into the quiet of the afternoon, letting the soft pulse of tiny moons, pocketed time and unspoken kindness wash over him. He breathed, slow and steady, carrying with him the quiet heroism of letting go. And in the hush of the room, in the delicate stretch between one heartbeat and the next, Morty slept. The first light of dawn brushed over the quiet streets, soft and tentative, as if the world had not yet woken and wanted to peek before stretching fully awake. Morty walked beside Rick, the garage looming ahead, familiar yet strangely luminous in the pale morning. The night had been long, full of tiny adventures that had felt larger than life, yet delicate, like dew forming on the edges of blades of grass. Behind them, the portals flickered and shimmered, catching the rising light in their liquid folds. One by one they closed as though the universe itself were blinking, eyelids descending slowly over its own eyes. Each closing portal left a small sigh, a whisper that faded into the morning air. Morty felt it in his chest, a sense of endings not as abrupt conclusions, but as gentle pauses, the world breathing slowly, giving him space to catch up. Rick walked with a quieter gait than usual, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his eyes reflecting the pale gold of early sunlight. Morty noticed the subtle tension in him, the faint echo of all the nights and mornings they had shared, of everything tucked away in the margins, the unspoken apologies, the hidden gifts, the soft constellations falling from sandwiches and drifting in pockets. Here, between fading portals and awakening streets, there was no rush. The universe seemed willing to wait a moment longer for them to walk through it. They passed a street lamp still holding the last shadows of night, the metal pole warm from the heat trapped during dark hours. Morty let his fingers brush against it, feeling the solidity of home after the fragile impermanence of portals and other dimensions. He thought of the tiny moons that had fallen, of the watch that had slowed, of the quiet rescues and whispered vent, of sandwiches with stars hidden inside. Each memory arrived not as a weight, but as a soft melody, layering over the morning, echoing in the spaces between their footsteps. "Looks different in the daylight," Morty said, voice almost a whisper, careful not to disturb the fragile hush of the early hour. Rick glanced down at him, a brief flicker of something unspoken in his eyes. Not amusement, not impatience, just a quiet acknowledgement. Morty had learned to read those small gestures, those nearly invisible threads of communication that carried more weight than words. The faint set of Rick's jaw, the way his shadow stretched across the pavement, the way his hands relaxed now, that the night's adventures were closing like doors behind them. All of it spoke volumes. "I guess," Rick murmured finally, tone softer than usual. "Everything always looks different in the daylight." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Morty understood that some truths were best left between the spaces of a conversation that was more felt than spoken. The portals behind them shivered in the air, translucent folds catching the first sunbeams, and then, one by one, each collapsed into nothingness. Morty imagined them folding like origami, like eyelids, shutting gently over a dreaming world. The faint hum of energy vanished, leaving only the soft chorus of morning, a distant bird, a neighbor's quiet footsteps, the rustle of leaves in a waking breeze. Morty realized that for every adventure, for every leap across dimensions, there was a return, a small grounding homecoming that held its own quiet magic. As they approached the garage, Morty felt a wave of gratitude rising, subtle and unhurried. Gratitude for the night that had unfolded, for the lessons hidden in quiet gestures, for the strange, patient ways that the universe allowed him to learn without chaos, without alarm. Gratitude for Rick, who gave both storms and silences, who carried worlds in his mind, but sometimes left a tiny corner open for Morty's own small discoveries. The garage door waited, solid and familiar. It smelled of oil and metal, of faint sparks that had burned and cooled, of all the equipment and experiments that held the echoes of a lifetime's curiosity. Morty paused at the threshold, taking in the space he had come to know as both sanctuary and bridge, a place where strange things happened, where worlds could be glimpsed and sometimes even touched, but where the ordinary rhythm of home still existed. Rick leaned against the side of the garage, arms crossed, watching the last shreds of portal light vanish into the air. Morty felt the quiet gratitude swell again, this time for the moment itself. The calm after the drift, the gentle completion of an adventure, the balance between chaos and care. No one needed to speak. The universe had closed its eyes and they were walking together, present and attentive, across the final steps of night into morning. Morty reached out and let his fingers brush against Rick's coat, a small gesture of recognition, of shared passage through places and times that existed beyond ordinary understanding. Rick did not flinch. Perhaps he noticed, perhaps he didn't, but in that small touch, Morty understood something fundamental. Connection was not loud or demanding. It was subtle, patient, waiting to be recognized by those who looked carefully enough. He imagined the traveler from the slowing watch, still carrying time softly, and the moons collected gently in earlier nights, drifting somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. The girl at the window of dreams, the tiny experiments of empathy, the blueprints of inventions that healed rather than harmed, all of these formed a quiet constellation of understanding. Morty had wandered through small universes and large, through subtle lessons and soft gestures, and now he carried them lightly, without urgency, folded neatly in the spaces between breaths. The garage door opened with a slow, familiar creak, a sound Morty knew as well as any lullaby. The interior smelled of warmth and promise, of circuits and tools and things not yet born, but quietly waiting. He stepped inside and felt the air settle around him, carrying the residue of all that had passed. Starlight folded into sandwiches, slow ticking watches, moons that had fallen and risen again in memory. Rick followed, closing the door gently behind them. The sound was final, but not harsh, like the settling of a book on a shelf or the last note of a soft melody. Morty allowed himself to exhale fully, letting the tension of walking between worlds drift away. The day was new, not demanding, and yet heavy with the promise of ordinary wonder. He looked at Rick, and for a moment, in the pale light, he saw not just the inventor, not just the storm of genius and chaos, but the quiet presence of someone who had guided him through 1,000 small awakenings. Gratitude, he realized, could exist without ceremony. It could exist simply in walking home together, in the space between portals and the familiar click of a garage door, in the hush of dawn that held worlds in its soft embrace. And so Morty walked step by step through the last fading echoes of portals into the garage, into the day, carrying with him the gentle memory of the night and the quiet certainty that gratitude, like time, could be patient, soft, and enduring. He let the door close behind him, let the last light of the portals fade, and with a soft smile he allowed himself to rest in the calm, carrying everything he had seen, learned, and felt into the quiet hum of the morning. Somewhere, still drifting, Morty felt the soft residue of nights that had been long but unhurried. The universe had not demanded brilliance or bravery, it had offered quiet moments instead, little openings to see, to touch, to understand without urgency. He thought of all the small experiments, the fallen moons, the hidden stars inside sandwiches, the watches that slowed, and travelers who wandered softly between worlds. Every act, no matter how subtle, had left a faint glow, like lanterns lit along the edges of dreams. The vents whispered again, faint echoes of conversations too gentle to call attention, carrying the kind of knowledge that arrives only when you are listening quietly. Morty smiled, remembering the lessons not taught but revealed. That heroism can be a hand extended in silence, that understanding can grow from patience, that wonder does not need to shout to be profound. He could feel all of it, still humming. Inside him, a resonance that would not fade because it was not imposed, only experienced. He pictured the girl at the window of dreams, speaking in phrases that made ordinary words seem heavy with meaning. He pictured the timid alien he had helped, the moonlight he had caught with careful hands, the watch he had released to another. Traveler, the blueprints of inventions that healed instead of harmed. And somewhere in the midst of all these moments, he saw himself, small and tentative, carrying not chaos but tenderness, like a lantern in the dark. The garages, the streets, the fading portals, all were part of a larger rhythm, a gentle looping, pattern of going and returning, of giving and taking, of noticing the quiet spaces between events where life actually happened. Morty could trace it in his mind like a constellation, each experience a faint point of light joined by invisible threads. The threads connected him to Rick, to the unseen visitors, to the moons, the vents, the dreams, the tiny acts of kindness he had witnessed and performed. They all formed a map, not of destinations, but of gentle guidance, a reminder that even in a world that could feel chaotic, there were places where everything moved at the pace of care. Somewhere, in the soft curling of memory, Morty understood. That first madness was not the frantic spinning of disorder. It was tenderness. It was a willingness to notice, to reach, to let the universe unfold without demanding it bend to his understanding. He saw the quiet genius of small gestures, of hands held gently, of eyes that watched without judgment, of toys repaired without speech, of watches released with patience. These were the markers of courage he had learned before knowing what courage truly meant. And as he drifted further in thought, the memories looped gently, not like a song repeating insistently, but like the soft, rhythmic pulse of breathing, the calm cadence that guides one into sleep. Each loop reminded him of lessons folded inside the other lessons, of kindness inside curiosity, of wonder inside quiet observation. Morty let himself move through them without effort, without need to hold on to any single moment, letting them rise and fall like gentle tides. He thought of the first portal, the scent of strange metal and glowing dust. He thought of the sandwich with stars within, a gift that held infinite possibilities in the form of something so simple. He thought of floating, of tiny moons falling and being gathered, of vents carrying voices that hinted at cosmic scale and unseen tenderness. He thought of the blueprints, the small rescues, the slowing watch, the girl who spoke in dreamlike phrases, the faint glimpse of his own voice in the future, reading stories that would comfort someone else. All of it interwove into a soft tapestry, and Morty felt the calm certainty of continuity. Even Rick's quiet gestures were part of it, repairs without speeches,
Eyes that watched, hands that left subtle guidance behind.
Morty realized that love, like the universe, could be invisible and persistent, subtle yet enduring, shaping understanding through soft insistence rather than loud demand. And it was in these gestures, in these quiet ripples through space and time, that Morty recognized the measure of his own growth, the first stirrings of someone who could hold tenderness as a kind of magic. He imagined himself walking home through fading portals, the eyelids of the universe closing slowly, leaving only memory and gratitude behind. He could feel the soft weight of the night dissolving into dawn, the air warming, the streets breathing quietly under the first light. And in that stillness, Morty realized he had learned something remarkable, that moments could be adventures without danger, that the cosmos could be glimpsed without fear, that the heart could guide understanding even when words failed. Morty let the images of moons and stars, of vents and windows, of tiny hands extended and watches released, drift gently across his mind like floating petals on a quiet pond. Each image carried a scent of tenderness, a trace of the lessons learned without urgency, and each one echoed softly, looping back to the ones before it, connecting everything into a rhythm he could feel without naming. He smiled softly, his eyes drifting closed in the comfort of the pattern, the gentle repetition of understanding. Somewhere, still drifting, Morty felt the resonance of all the first experiences, the quiet heartbeat of the universe in which he had wandered, and the small certainty that this calm, tender madness would always be a part of him. And as the soft loops of memory curled in the air, he imagined the listener, someone lying somewhere, letting these words settle like feathers on their mind. He imagined them breathing in sync with the cadence of quiet reflection, letting the gentle echo of lessons, moons, stars, vents, watches, and sandwiches unfold into their own private, calm universe. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's going to be okay, man. The end.